Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. As tensions rise over trade and security, the United States is taking a calculated pause, delaying reciprocal tariffs on allies for 3 months and signaling a new approach to negotiations. But the stakes are high for South Korea as President Trump is pushing for a sweeping package deal, tying tariffs and defense cost sharing together under one diplomatic umbrella. With Acting President Han Duck-soo stepping into delicate talks and top U.S. lawmakers and officials poised to visit Seoul, questions loom. Could this be a breakthrough or a pressure tactic? And what strategies can Seoul deploy as it navigates trade, security, and shifting alliances just weeks before a new administration takes office? For more on this, we invite Min Jung-hoon, professor of Korean National Diplomatic Academy, here in the studio with us. Welcome, Professor.
Good evening.
And also joining us online is Christophe Godong, professor of political science at Kookmin University. Great to have you, Professor.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
So let's start our discussion with Professor Min. So the U.S. has announced a 3-month delay in implementing reciprocal tariffs on countries other than China. It also excluded like electronic products such as smartphones and computers from the tariff list. What's the rationale, do you think, behind this?
I think that the Trump government uses tariffs for two purposes, reducing the trade deficits and promoting the revival of manufacturing industries in the United States. To reduce the trade deficit, the President Trump perceives that U.S. has long been harmed by unfair trade practices on the international stage. So he's trying to reduce the trade deficit by using various tariffs such as universal baseline tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, and item-by-item tariffs. Specifically, he's trying to reduce the trade deficit by imposing a 10% baseline the tariffs on all imported items. And he's also trying to reduce the trade deficit by imposing reciprocal the tariffs on countries with large trade surplus with the United States and to create a more favorable trade environment for U.S. through bilateral negotiations with the countries. Meanwhile, the tariffs are being used as a way of revitalizing manufacturing industries in the country. The previous Biden government tried to promote investments and expand the manufacturing facilities in the United States by providing subsidies to the companies. But President Trump, as you know, has a negative perception of subsidies and believes that if tariffs are imposed, companies will build factories in the United States in order to avoid the tariffs. In fact, since the beginning of the second Trump government, many companies have promised to build factories within the United States. So as the Trump government is rapidly imposing tariffs on a wide range of items, the global community is worried that it's going to make a negative impact, huge impact on the global economy. But despite the concerns, President Trump is unlikely to stop using tariffs aggressively, and the world is watching to see what the outcome his experiments will bring about.
Right, so it was a strategic pause, not really a retreat. Now let's also bring in Professor Godong to the conversation. So this 3-month grace period puts a spotlight on possibilities for renegotiations. On April 9th, Acting President Han Duck-soo and President Trump held their first phone call. Would you consider this conversation a meaningful step towards establishing direct communication between the two leaders?
If I'm a bit blunt, first, it will need to be established whether it is possible or not to have a meaningful conversation with President Trump. From what Professor Min just explained, I think the key takeaway here is the concept of experiment. President Trump very obviously is trying some sort of point-to-point navigation. He doesn't care about what the rest of the world thinks of him, basically. His only concern is about how beneficial all this could be or not to the US economy. So what we see now is that every week, almost every day, if not every hour, he's trying something new. He's trying something new, and as you can see last week, the reaction of stock exchange markets was catastrophic. Then eventually, he was forced, if not to retreat, at least to call for a sort of truce on his policy. So, in fact, again, if I am a bit blunt now, President Han Duck-soo, as an acting president, is only here for a couple months more, and so there isn't much he can do about the future, unfortunately. But the good news is that, on the other hand, I am not sure there is that much to be done with President Trump. For instance, last week, many other world leaders from France, from Germany, from other Western nations tried to call him to make him hear reason. And as you must have heard, President Trump just perceived him as them trying to, quote unquote, kiss his ass. So these are challenging times for political science, because now we've got the US that is the largest democracy there is in the world, and this democracy is basically headed by a president that doesn't seem to care a lot about his allies. And first, we need to face this fact coldly, seeing Trump for what he is and not for what we wish he were. We need to look at him for what he is. And what he is quite an unpleasant truth to look at.
Right, so it is indeed a very tough situation for a lot of political leaders at this point. Now, going back to the talks with South Korea's acting president Han Duck-soo, Trump has mentioned one-stop shopping, suggesting his intention to bundle tariff negotiations and defense cost sharing into a single package. Professor Min, what kind of message is he trying to send with this approach?
Yeah, people are talking about his message. Basically, I think it's a good news to hear that the two leaders had a phone call recently, because there was a growing concern in South Korea that the South Korean government was failing to communicate with the United States counterparts at the top level. And it was known that the two leaders talked several issues like a trade balance, tariffs, energy and shipbuilding cooperation, and defense payments. And as you mentioned, it was reported that President Trump preferred to have one-stop shopping to make a package deal for both the tariff and defense cost-sharing negotiations. Personally, I think that President Trump want to put all negotiating items on the table together and make negotiations and reach the agreements as quickly as possible. And if things go well as he wanted, President Trump will show off such outcomes to his domestic audience. But I also think that President Trump knows that it would be hard to make a package deal for tariff and burden sharing negotiations. As you know, Korean people are very sensitive to the outcome of burden sharing negotiations, and it takes a relatively long time before reaching an agreement. And the two countries, South Korea and US, already finished the deal for the next 5 years, 2026 to 2030, last year. So it is expected that Korean people will feel uncomfortable when US requests a renegotiation. And it would not be possible for the renegotiation to make a progress or reach a final agreement under the current transition government, which will last only 2 months. So it would be more realistic and pragmatic for the two countries to just focus on making progress in the tariff negotiation under the current transition government and allow the new South Korean government to take the responsibility for their burden sharing negotiations.
Right, so we'll have to wait a little bit more for a stronger decision on that. But like Professor Min has just touched upon, this is the first time the U.S. has linked tariffs and defense cost sharing. And of course, the South Korean government remains cautious about this, saying national security matters like defense should be separately addressed from trade. Professor Godang, what are your thoughts? What kind of strategy do you think is needed to navigate this so-called package deal?
Well, first, you're very right to emphasize that it is the first time the U.S. is linking security deals with trade issues. But something I would like to mention is that Trump is actually saying the exact same thing to Europe. He's been arguing for months and months that NATO was almost single-handedly funded by America and that the US was financing for Europe's nuclear umbrella with no clear benefit from the American point of view. So something interesting here is that Trump, as a businessman, is actually trying to reset American diplomacy all over the world, in Europe as well as in Asia and everywhere else, on the very, very same premises, on the very, very same principles. These principles being business, being money. He doesn't care for democracy. He cares solely for the benefits to be had here. So now to answer your question more directly, as Professor Min just explained, now in Korea, the acting president and the government are just here for a couple months. So there isn't much that Korea can do for the time being. But I think that it is a blessing in disguise. Why? Because the situation is changing almost day by day. So if Trump is linking the economy and defense, and if for the moment, in the lack of a new president, Korea cannot make any significant move in order to implement significant policy changes in terms of defense, etc., what it means is that Korea can buy time. And in these troubled times we live in, I think wait and see. What Trump is conducting, Professor Min very rightfully argues that Trump is trying to conduct some sort of worldwide policy experiment. Experiments are dangerous, especially when conducted by people like President Trump. So what Korea can do now is buying time. And I think it is a strategy that President Han is trying to implement, and for the moment, quite successfully, because it's never good in times of crisis to be on the front line. And for the moment, fortunately, Korea is not.
Right, especially this tariff, since these tariffs are not only addressing South Korea, so we can actually have time to wait and see. Now, Professor Min, South Korea's head of trade negotiations at the Trade Ministry visited the U.S. for talks last week, and it's reported that South Korea put LNG imports and shipbuilding cooperation on the table. How effective might these proposals be in the broader negotiations in terms of tariffs?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier today, the Trump government is using tariffs to reduce its trade deficits and expand manufacturing facilities and make more high-paying jobs within the country. So what South Korean government offers needed to contribute to reducing the U.S. trade deficits and creating high-paying jobs in the country. More importantly, South Korea also needed to consider its domestic situations. So South Korean government should consider if its offer to the United States does not make a negative impact on its economic and industrial basis in South Korea, like losing domestic jobs and moving out core technology production process. So I think that energy cooperation like oil and natural gas imports from U.S. and participating in Alaska LNG pipeline projects would be effective to achieve what both U.S. and South Korea want from the deal. Specifically, by exporting more energy to South Korea, U.S. will reduce its trade deficits with South Korea, and it will also create high-paying jobs for U.S. people from the LNG project. Meanwhile, South Korea can diversify its energy supply and by importing American energy and can have useful negotiating cards with the United States. And along with energy cooperation, shipbuilding cooperation between the two countries can also be effective for their tariff negotiation. As you know, U.S. badly wants to enhance its shipbuilding capabilities as a way of checking the rise of China. Unfortunately, however, the American shipbuilding industry has lost its competitiveness to the Chinese counterparts in terms of building, repairing, and operating battleships and commercial ships. So it wants its reliable ally like South Korea, who has the world-class shipbuilding capabilities, to help the U.S. restore its shipbuilding capacity. And there is no doubt that it would be a very useful negotiating card for South Korea.
Right, so investment and cooperation in other areas would be helpful. President Trump has floated the idea of reducing or even withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea, but key figures in the U.S. government like U.S. Forces Korea Commander Javier Brunson have recently voiced opposition to such a move. Professor Go-dong, how could these differing views within America shape the upcoming negotiations?
In fact, you're very right to mention General Xavier Benson, because there were a lot of other prominent voices in America that were very adamant about voicing their concerns about the new path that President Trump is trying to impose on U.S. diplomacy. Even right after his inauguration in January, I'd like you to remember that he stripped General Mark Milley, that is one of the top officers in the American army, basically, he even stripped him of his security clearance. So right now, in fact, what I think is that eventually what has happened with tariffs, that is Trump's being forced to somehow retreat. The same is about to happen eventually about defense policies, because these policies basically make no sense. If US troops were to be all sent back to America, the most direct consequence would be that China would eventually take over. China would establish itself as the dominant hegemon in the region. And a sure thing is that Trump does not want that. So here I think it is most important not to panic, because eventually the dust will settle. In the case of South Korea, as Professor Min just mentioned, the South Korean economy is solid, and the South Korean economy is producing a lot of commodities, typically semiconductors, that will be exempt from tariffs, from what it seems. So I am not sure the shock will be that harmful on the Korean economy, and even more so, if China is to take the blow, and it seems that China and the US are about to waging an actual trade war now, then in this case, you could imagine that other Asian economies like Korea could be benefiting from this situation. What I think is that when it comes to defense, everything Trump is arguing about NATO or about Korea makes so little sense that I cannot imagine that in the US military, there will not be competent people that will eventually slow him down. And a last point I would like to make is that something we can remember from Trump's negotiations with Kim Jong-un a few years ago about North Korean nuclear weapons is that basically when an issue becomes too complex, Trump doesn't have patience to follow up. Eventually, our best hope is that he just loses interest. about defense questions, and he gets back to whatever he was doing before.
So one thing that would be clear is that we don't need to panic yet because nothing has been fixed yet, right?
As we always say in French, hope is not, despair is not a political option.
All right, that's really good saying right of now. That's now, Professor Min. Pro-Korea members of the U.S. Congress are expected to visit South Korea this week. Given that the Congress can serve as a counterbalance to the Trump administration, do you think this visit could stand as an opportunity to shape future negotiations?
Yes. Personally, I think that it's important for South Korea to enhance its relations with U.S. members of Congress and business leaders and labor unions, which consist of the various American political actors. As you know, President Trump announced a 90-day pause of reciprocal tariffs on most countries except China. And many experts guess that President Trump made the decision mainly because U.S. business leaders were worried about the uncertainty of American markets. So it shows that President Trump cares about how domestic political and economic actors perceive and respond to his policies. So it could be a useful opportunity for South Korea to improve its relations with the U.S. members of Congress, especially Republican lawmakers, and let them address South Korea's values and concerns to President Trump. And likewise, South Korea can improve its relations with American business leaders, labor unions, state governments, and state politicians. It means that South Korea needed to reach out to more various political and economic counterparts in the United States. And it reflects that as South Korea's economic and technological capabilities get bigger and bigger, it will have more influence in American communities and federal, state, and local levels. So we can see the situation where public diplomacy and lobbying itself are getting more important to maintain and improve our K-US relations.
Definitely. So in moments like this, strong congressional ties could be part of Seoul's strongest asset as well. Now, we will have to wrap up our program at this point tonight. Thank you so much for your insights and your time, Professor Min.
Thank you.
And Professor Godang, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.